So now that we've talked about the individual that performs the value opinion, now we're going to talk about value itself. And in order to have value in the real estate market, a property has to have certain characteristics. And we use an acronym to help us to remember those characteristics. And it's DUST, D-U-S-T. That's demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. So let's start with demand. In order to have value, somebody's got to want it. If there's no demand for whatever the item might be, then it doesn't have any value. When the demand is down, well, the prices tend to go down. When the demand is up, prices tend to go up. So basically what we can say is that price tracks or follows demand. You have a high demand, high price, low demand, low price. But the next thing you need is utility. If I can't use it for whatever my intended purpose is, then it doesn't have any value for me. So it has to meet my utility. One of the most important things an appraiser looks at is if the property is used for its best use, whatever that might be. And so it's very important that the item be able to be used for the intended purpose that it's sought to be used for. And the next one is scarcity. Well, there's only so much real estate that is available. The planet Earth is approximately 80% water and approximately 20% land, which means there's a finite supply of real property that can be used for human occupancy. And so scarcity is a really important characteristic and has a lot to do with the value of a specific piece of property. And then the last one is transferability. And transferability basically speaks to the ease at which an item can be transferred from one party to another. If one party cannot transfer it to the other party, well, then it won't have any value to the person that is seeking to receive that particular item because they don't have a way to actually get it because it's not transferable. So in order to have value, it's got to be transferable, and transferability is a really important characteristic of value. Next, we're going to talk about market value. It's a term that's loosely used in the marketplace, and market value is really important. Market value is the most probable price that a property would bring in a fair sale. So it's not necessarily the highest price, it's not necessarily the lowest price, it's the most probable price, the most frequent price. And it's got to be an open, competitive market in order for us to achieve market value. A buyer and a seller has to be acting on prudent knowledge. They have to have all of the necessary information to make an informed decision, and the price cannot be affected by unusual circumstances, like if there's a huge seller concession or if it's a distressed property. Those are things that will definitely have an impact. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at the most probable price and it's not influenced by some unusual circumstances. Some of the essential factors in rendering an opinion of value. Well, one would be that the buyer and the seller are unrelated and acting without undue pressure. It's really important in the creation of value. And then the buyer and the seller must be well informed about the property, which basically means it's got to be inspected. They have to know the condition of the property. And then, of course, the property has to be on the market for a reasonable amount of time so that it gets proper exposure in the marketplace and we can create a market for that specific property. And then the payment must be either a cash payment or the equivalent of a cash payment, like a mortgage finance type of a transaction. And then, of course, the price has to represent normal consideration for the property that's being sold. And that's very important. Now, there's a big difference between market value and market price. And this has been a place that some people have been confused about. Market value, though, as I just stated, is an opinion. It's not the highest price, it's not the lowest price. It's just an opinion of value. For most people, when you look into the marketplace for real estate, they use a term called list price. That's list price. Well, list price is an opinion of value. It's generally going to be formulated by the real estate professional, and it's going to be done under the supervision of the managing and supervising broker. And the market value is an opinion of value based on an analysis of the data. So you do a CMA and you can create or formulate what market value is, just an opinion. But market price is a real number. Market price is what the property actually sold for in the marketplace. It's the sales price. So for all intensive purposes, when you look at list price, well, that's market value. It's somebody's opinion. When you look at the sold price, the actual close price, well, that's market price, and that's an actual number. And we use that to help us to formulate what the value of a property is. Now, there's another term that you have to be familiar with. It's cost. Cost, it can sometimes be similar to market value. It can be sometimes similar to market price. But generally, cost is considered a historic fact. It's the price that was paid for the property previously. And so market value can be the same as market value. It can be the same as market price. But generally, as the property, from the point that the property is built, the market value, the market price, and the costs are generally very close to one another. But as time goes on, cost becomes a historic fact, and the numbers start to move away from one another. Now, there are some basic value principles that are really important, and this is some of the fun stuff about appraisal that I really enjoy. The basic value principles. And the basic value principles are used by the appraiser to substantiate the subject property's value. And the one thing that's really important is that people understand that most people buy real estate for anticipation. They can believe that there's the value of the property that might increase, and that's very important. If I anticipate that if I buy this for an amount, later in the future it's going to be worth more money. So I'm anticipating an increase in value. But I also can be anticipating the potential of receiving residual revenue as I release the property to tenants. And so anticipation is a very important value principle. Some people in the residential world are buying property because they anticipate being able to take their kids to the local park or use the local school system. So there's a lot of things that fall into the category of anticipation. An example would be a 30-screen theater being built a block away from the property would decrease the value. Or new homes valued at over $1 million being built a quarter mile away could possibly increase the value. So anticipation is very important. The next value principle that we're going to talk about is change. Well, change is the value principle that basically indicates to us that no physical or economic condition remains the same. And many people buy or invest in real estate based on the change that they may believe will occur in the future. And so if you combine anticipation and change, it can create value for you. The next value principle that's really important is competition. Competition speaks to the interaction of supply and demand. And many properties in the area on the market affects the value. The more competition, the more impact on value. Well, the next value principle we're going to talk about is conformity. If you guys notice, in many subdivisions and many municipalities, there are a lot of properties that look similar to one another with respect to the design, the construction, the size, the age. There is a lot of similarities there. And that's because of the value principle of conformity tells us that properties are worth more or have additional value when they're in harmony with their surroundings. And that's why you see aesthetically a lot of the properties in an area will look alike. And because of conformity, and that's a very important value principle. Now, contribution is very important, and especially in today's marketplace. We've just left a downturn in the economy, and as we move away from the downturn in the economy, well, we're going to have properties that may need to have some rehabilitation or renovations or updating, and so we need to be well versed in contribution. Contribution is the value principle that tells us that value of any part of a property is measured by its effect on the value of the whole thing. If I were to do this particular thing, like add an in-ground swimming pool, well, would it create additional value? Would it create additional income? And that's when we're talking about contribution. In our example, a home in Chicago area with an in-ground pool would be harder to sell during the winter than in the summer because of the contribution of the swimming pool. Now, highest and best use is really important. Highest and best use is the first consideration that an appraiser makes when he's going to appraise a property. Highest and best use is the most profitable single use that a property may be put. The use has to be legally possible. It has to be financially feasible, but it also has to be physically possible and maximally productive. Like in the market area of Chicago, where there's some places that are very densely populated. And so there could be a situation where it may be highest and best use to tear down an existing structure and build a parking garage that's more accommodating for the density within a particular area. And so highest and best use is very important, and a lot of times decisions about development are made based on highest and best use. Now, another value principle that's really important is increasing and diminishing returns. Well, if an improvements that produce an increase of income or an increase of value, well, that's the law of increasing returns. Improvements that do not increase the income or do not increase the value, that's the law of diminishing returns. An example would be if that a house was valued or a property were valued at $150,000 and the seller considered putting in a new kitchen cabinets for $20,000. Well, the law of diminishing returns may apply in that situation if it does not create additional value or additional income. Now, there's another value principle, it's called plottage. Plottage is a value principle that teaches us that if we merge individual adjacent lots together into one larger contiguous lot, well, all of the lots added together will have more value than the single individual lots. And the process that's used to merge the properties together is a process that we call assemblage. And that's where we're going to merge adjacent lots together into a big contiguous lot. Now, in addition to that, if two lots had a pertinent easement, well, an owner of parcel A bought parcel B, well, the easement would no longer be needed because the easement is the right to use the land of another for a particular purpose. And if we merge them together, that would basically eliminate the purpose of the appurtenant easement and it would no longer exist. The next value principle that we're going to talk about is regression and progression. Regression is a situation where the value of a better quality home adversely affects the value of a lesser quality home. So regression, means go backwards. So basically we have a situation where we have a very nice house that's being pulled down by the neighbors. If you have a bunch of raggedy neighbors, it's going to bring down your value. Progression is just the opposite of that. The value of a modest or a modest price home is going to increase because of the fancier properties on the block. So if your neighbors are awesome and have wonderful homes, even if you have a crappy home, yours is going to be worth more money. And that's progression, and pro means to go forward. So you're being pulled up by your neighbors with progression, and you're being pulled down by your neighbors with regression. Now, value principle substitution basically tells us that the maximum value of a property is set by how much it would cost to purchase an equally desirable and valuable property. Basically, if the one that I want is not available, I'm probably willing to pay the same amount for one that is available that I might not have considered previously. Substitution is the foundation of the sales comparison approach, and it's a very important value principle. Now, the next one is supply and demand. Supply and demand is very important with respect to value. Value of a property depends on the number and the price of the properties that are available in the marketplace and the number of the prospective purchasers that are willing to pay for the properties that are available in the marketplace. As we discussed earlier on in these value principles, we talked about demand. Well, demand and price have a very interesting relationship. Price follows demand, and so if we have a high price, we're going to have if we have a high demand, we will have a high price. If we have a low demand, we may have a low price. But supply increases, a value is probably going to decrease. When demand increases, the value is probably going to increase as well. And those are all of the value principles. The next thing we're going to talk about are the approaches to value. And these are the approaches that are used by the appraiser to substantiate the market value of the subject property. And the appraiser uses 3 different approaches. And usually they're going to use a more weighted approach depending on the type of property that's being appraised. The first approach we're going to talk about is the sales comparison approach. The sales comparison approach a lot of times is referred to as the market data approach. And the sales comparison approach is almost identical to what a real estate professional does when they put together a market analysis, because the appraiser is going to put the most weight on this approach when they're appraising residential property. And so we're talking about single family homes, condominiums, townhomes, duplexes, traditional transactions. Well, they're going to put more weight on the sales comparison approach because there's more data available. Because what we do with the sales comparison approach is we're going to estimate the value by comparing properties that have recently sold that are in the subject area that have similar amenities to the subject properties. So it's very similar to a market analysis, but it's one of the three approaches to value, and it's referred to as a sales comparison approach. And the way that we do it is the sales price of comparable properties have to be adjusted. We're going to adjust it for financial concessions that the seller might pay to the buyer. We're going to make adjustments for market conditions, whether it be the interest rate, supply and demand, or other indicators. We're also going to make adjustments for the condition of the sale. Maybe there might be repairs that are required. The buyer may pay cash. There could be a short sale. But the conditions of the sale are very important, and we're going to include that in the sales comparison approach. And because market conditions can change, the date of the sale is very important. Market conditions are very, very important. A transaction that closed a month ago is very different than a transaction that closed a year ago. So because of the conditions changing on a reoccurring basis, we want to make sure that we keep the dates of sale as close as possible to the subject property. Now, location is very important as well. Location or area preference is something that is very important in the sales comparison approach. We want similar properties that are in the subject market area. And we want to make sure that the physical features of the property are as similar as possible as well. The structure, the age, the size, the condition, the upgrades, we want those to be as similar as possible to the subject property. And then the comparable sales, we want to make sure, again, that they're within the shortest span of time. Of course, it would be best to keep it within one year. 6 months to 1 year would be the best. And we want it to be as close to the subject property as well, within the mile. So within the mile, within the last 6 months to a year, that's going to be a really good comparable. If it's got similar amenities and features and structure, those are going to be comparable properties that we might want to include in our market and in our appraisal. Now, the subject property is never adjusted. We're going to adjust the comparables because we're trying to figure out what the property is worth. And so we're never going to adjust the comparables. And the way that we do our adjustments are one of two ways. If the comparable is better, we're going to subtract from the price that the comparable sold for. If the comparable is poorer, we're going to add to the price that the comparable sold for. And an example would be if the subject property is 3 beds, 2 baths, and the comparable is 4 beds, 2 baths, well, it seems that the comparable should be worth more. Because the comparable is better, we're going to subtract, and so that we can figure out what the subject is worth. And the reverse would be the same if the comparable was in a poorer condition. We would have to add to the comparable so that we can bring the comparable up to the subject property value. And this example demonstrates that. The next approach to value that the appraiser uses is called the cost approach. The cost approach to value is going to be where we're going to take the new construction costs of the property and use that to substantiate the value of the subject property. And an appraiser will put more weight on the cost approach when they're appraising new construction property, or if it's a special purpose property like a school or hospital or a church, they're going to put more weight on the cost approach. And that's because there may not be enough sales data to use the sales comparison approach when you have special purpose property like schools and hospital and churches. Like how many churches are on the market? So we may not be able to find enough comparables to do the sales comparison approach because there's not enough data. And then we're going to put more weight on the cost approach. And the cost approach, it has 5 steps that we're going to make sure that we're performing. We're going to first estimate the value of the land. as if it were vacant and available to be put to its highest and best use. And then we're going to estimate the current construction costs of the building and the improvements, and that's really important. And then lastly, we're going to estimate the cost, or the amount of accrued depreciation resulting from the property's physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, or external depreciation. Now, the way that depreciation works is that we're going to deduct the accrued depreciation from the construction costs. And then once we've deducted the accrued depreciation, we're going to add the estimated land value back into the equation. Because to depreciate the cost of building and the site, we have to basically take out the land because land does not appreciate. And so we figure out what the land value is, we figure out what the construction cost is, and we figure out what the depreciation is. And that's how we're going to apply the cost approach to value. And in the example, we've demonstrated how you would calculate the depreciation. And this is using what is referred to as straight line depreciation, is what this is referred to. Now, reproduction costs and replacement costs new are very important in determining the value of the property using the cost approach. The reproduction cost is the cost at current prices of an exact duplicate. Replacement cost new is the cost to construct an improvement that's similar to the subject property using current construction methods and materials. It's not necessarily a duplicate, it's a similar structure. And I'm sure many of you have seen this before in certain areas where they try to create a new structure that kind of is similar to some of the existing structures. That would be similar to a replacement cost new, as opposed to a reproduction cost where they're duplicating the exact property over again. But there are 4 methods in determining reproduction or replacement costs. There's the square foot method, where the cost per square foot of a recently built structure is multiplied by the number of square feet of the subject property. And the appraiser calculates the living space above ground and does not include basements or garages or outdoor space. The other 3 methods are the unit in place method, the quantity survey method, and the index method would also be possibly used by the appraiser to determine the replacement costs or reproduction costs. Depreciation, as we mentioned, is the loss of value due to any cause. And as I had indicated before, land does not depreciate. And there are various things that are included in the definition of depreciation. And depreciation can be curable or incurable. Well, curable means that we can fix it. Incurable means that we cannot fix it. And it's really important. And some of the things that you consider, whether it's curable or incurable, is how much it costs, is it financially possible, is it physically possible, and is it legal, right? And that would help you to determine whether it's curable or incurable. Now, there is a form of depreciation known as physical deterioration. Well, physical deterioration can be curable or incurable, but it depends on if it's financially feasible, physically possible, and legal. A shopping center that might require a facelift or an improvement of the storefronts. Well, that could be something that's curable if it just needs a little facelift or some updating. Functional obsolescence can be curable or incurable. Something that's functional but it's obsolete is what functional obsolescence is. Like in today's marketplace, if there's a 4-bedroom home with 1 bath, most people would consider that to be functionally obsolescent. Because most people want more additional bathrooms in today's living arrangements. A large home with a small bedroom or small closets that have pull string lights, those would be considered functionally obsolescent. Office with too many pillars. An 8-track player in your car is functionally obsolescent. That's a good example. All right. Or if you're still using a beta drive to watch movies, that's functionally obsolescent. Okay. Now, I had mentioned earlier straight line depreciation, and usually that's what we're going to use in order to determine what the depreciation is to date on a particular property. And straight line depreciation, it basically assumes that the depreciation, it happens evenly over the economic life of the property. Basically, you take the property's cost and divide it by the number of years expected in the economic life, and that's how you derive at the annual depreciation. And an example of that is that if a property were valued at $300,000, it could have a land value of $75,000 and the improvement value of $225,000. Well, if the improvement is expected to last for 60 years, the straight line depreciation would be $3,750, because if we take the $225,000 and divide it by 60 years, that gives us an even or straight line depreciation of $3,750 per year. The last approach to value that an appraiser uses is the income approach to value. And the income approach to value is going to be more weighted when it's in true income producing property, like a shopping center, an office building, or an apartment building. We would put more weight on the income approach to value. And it's where we're going to base the present value on the rights to future income. How much is it worth for me to buy this thing and be able to collect or generate the income in the future? And income generated will be used to determine the value of the property. And an appraiser takes 5 steps to create an income approach to value. They're going to estimate the annual potential gross income and deduct an appropriate allowance for vacancy, rent loss, based on the appraiser's research in the specific market area. And they're going to establish what's called the effective gross income. Well, they're going to deduct an annual operating expense from the effective gross income to arrive at the net operating income. And it's really important that you all remember that mortgage payments like principal and interest and capital expenditures are not considered expenses and not included in this equation. Establish a capitalization rate. And usually we would do this by estimating the price a typical investor would pay based on the comparable properties in the area. And we're going to use that capitalization rate and apply it to the property's annual net income to arrive at the estimate value of the property. And now I get to introduce you guys to my buddy Irv. Irv went fishing with his friends Jim and Grim. And Irv was a really good fisherman, but this particular time he fell into the water and Jim and Grim had to fish him out in the net. And the reason why I tell you guys this story is because Irv is always going to use net numbers. And so maybe that'll help you to remember it. But Irv is the formula we'll use to determine what the value of a property is. When we know one or two of the 3 things, we can use Irv. If we know the value of the property and the cap rate, we can use Irv to figure out the income. If we know the income and the value, we can use Irv to determine what the cap rate is. If we know what the income is and the cap rate, we can determine what the value is. By using these formulas and applying them, it'll help us a lot, and we can get to the value of the property very fast using this particular formula. But just remember, Irv got caught in a net, so we're going to always use net numbers when we're using the Irv formula. And we have an example here for you that explains it a little bit more in detail. But it's always net operating income on commercial properties when doing the calculations, and that's very important. And in other situations where you have true income producing properties, where if it's a commercial property like an office building or a commercial rental property, we're going to use Jim or Grim. Those are the people that went fishing with Irv, if you remember. And remember, they had to fish him out with a net. Well, with Jim and Grim, they had to fish him out, and it was gross. And so with Jim and Grim, we use gross numbers, GRM or GIM. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to use the gross rent and determine what the value is, or we're going to use the gross income and determine what the value is. Well, the gross rent multiplier, the multiplier of the gross monthly rent is used to produce the property's value. And we're going to use this when it's 1 to 4 units residential. We're going to use the GRM. So if we take the sales price and divide it by the gross monthly rent, well, it'll tell us what the value is. If we take the sales price and divide it by the multiplier, it'll tell us what the gross monthly rent should be. If we know what the gross monthly rent is and we know what the multiplier is, well, it'll tell us what the value of that investment is. And that's the GRM. That's Grim. Now, Jim is his buddy, and we're going to use Jim when it's 5 units or more. That's when it's a true income producing property. And we're going to take the multiplier of the gross annual income, and we're going to establish what the value of the property is. So if I know what the sales price is, and I know what the gross income is on an annual basis, well, I can figure out what the multiplier is. If I know what the sales price is and the multiplier, I can figure out what the gross annual income is. If I know the gross annual income and the multiplier, I can figure out what the value of that property might be. So that's Jim and Grimm. And those always use gross numbers as opposed to Irv, where we're using net numbers. Now, at the end of the day, the appraiser has to establish or determine what they feel the property is worth. They've done the sales comparison approach, they've done the cost approach, and they've performed the income approach. Once we've basically finished all approaches to value, the next thing that the appraiser has to do is what's called reconciliation. It's the art of analyzing and effectively weighing the various approaches to value and basically coming up with a final opinion of value of the subject property, and that's what reconciliation entails. Now, there are various processes in the appraisal of property, and it's key to an accurate appraisal. It really lies in the collection and analysis of data. There's various forms of data. There's general data and specific data. Well, general data is national, regional, municipal, or neighborhood, very local, hyper-local. But then there's what's called specific data, and that's the details of the subject property and the comparable properties. And then there's data for each approach. There's the sales data, the cost data, and income and expense data. And all of these must be considered and accurately portrayed in that final opinion of value. And once they've completed all of the approaches to value and performed reconciliation, well, the appraiser is going to put all of this on a report. Once the approaches have been reconciled and the opinion has been reached, the appraiser prepares a report for the client to substantiate what the value of the subject property is. Thank you, guys. And that ends our session on appraisal.